today are Amy. I'm sorry, Amy Stewart. She's at Southern Illinois University, and her talk is her paper is entitled "Estimate Trauma, Intimate Ethics: Kristevan Revolt in the Artwork of Kara Walker." And Bethany Henning at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Her paper is entitled Ezekiel 7 and the Permanent Efficacy of Grace, a Recovery in Aesthetic Experience of the Remainder of Devastation.
And I'll be reading Sara Beardsworth's paper
Oh, yes,
for her.
I'm sorry, I forgot to mention. I'm not doing a very good job of this. So, Sara Beardsworth's paper, which is entitled Subject of Diremption, Kristevan Revolt. Would you like to, will you be starting with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I'm Bethany, and I'll be reading Sarah's paper for her. Kristeva has written that revolt is realized not or not so much in the world of action, but rather in that of psychical life and its social manifestations, writing, thought, art. There is an equivocation here. After all, is it not or not so much in the world of action that is meant? The equivocation registers the simultaneous need and uncertainty of this distinction between the world of action and that of psychical life where revolt is realized. I draw on Gillian Rose's thought on action in order to form a response to Kristeva on revolt. Revolt today aspires to recovery of motility in the face of a problem with modernity that is nowhere more acute than when it fails to be recognized. How can one be sure then of the basis of one's own revolt? That it is not experienced as a part of the problem of modernity rather than being part of a response to it. The challenge is that of finding a voice that is equal to this question. There is one voice that spoke out before Kristeva and Rose. Arendt, too, felt the need for revolt, which she saw as distinctly political. To Arendt, human fulfillment lies in the political experience known to the men of revolution as public happiness or public freedom. Acting in concert generates the power to keep the public realm in existence. Here, revolt is identified with action. However, Arendt opposed the political to the social realm, reduced to the economic. This risks raising the public realm to political purity. Her separation of the social and the political rests on an unmoving distinction between the private and the public. To Kristeva and Rose, this response to the problem of modernity merely carries in its voice the condition of lack of motility for the subject of modernity. They overcome this in different, but I will argue, strangely complementary ways. Kristeva herself does not follow through Arendt's writings on revolution, resistance, and dissent. Theoretical and existential difficulties stand in the way. What she finds missing in Arendt's approach is that which, for her, is essential to the whole question, a radical inner experience. What for Arendt could belong only to the merely private sphere is precisely something that for Kristeva must mean much more. Where Arendt denounced the pervasion of the private into the public, creating the denigrated social realm, Kristeva turns to a sense of revolt that indicates freedoms that may still lurk inside the social. We discover the reasons for her criticism of Arendt in her way of moving between psychoanalysis and modern writing. This movement is a highly suggestive and promising approach. Why then turn to Rose for further elucidation of our problem, especially since she is so different, insisting on philosophical comprehension of modern social and political experience through readings of Hegel after Marx and Adorno? Here we seem to be a long way from Kristeva's placement of revolt in respect of intimacy. However, perhaps we can better understand Kristeva's equivocation over the world of action, and that in which revolt is realized by seeing it also through her other eyes. Here Arendt may serve as a bridge. Kristeva simultaneously appreciates and criticizes Arendt. For cogent reasons, her reading loses something of Arendt's political concept of action. Rose retains the political while at the same time being critical of the central dichotomy of the social and political in Arendt. She focuses on Arendt's failure to develop her comprehension of the world of action. What is at stake between Rose and Kristeva on action and revolt are different views of the impasses of modernity and the motility that nonetheless remains to the modern subject. Arendt is the intermediary between the two in this paper, but this does not allow us to settle the distinction between the worlds of action and revolt, or to reveal their relation. Instead, I take the two critiques of Arendt to constitute what I would like to call a chiasmus, in which indefinite relation between the action and revolt is figured rather than forgotten. I will first outline revolt in Kristeva and action in Rose. Kristeva tells of a new species of rebels, who are discovering for themselves that there is no answer to the social, historic, and political dead ends without a radical inner experience. Intimate Revolt stresses retrospective return, which makes the faculty of representation and questioning what specifies the human being against their ceasing to think for themselves. To Kristeva, the suspension of retrospective return is the suspension of thought, an Arendtian theme. Intimate Revolt relates the dead ends of modernity above all to the nihilism that shares in the suspension of thought. This is where we are. We can either renounce revolt by withdrawing into old values, or indeed new ones that do not look back on themselves and do not question themselves, or, on the contrary, relentlessly repeat retrospective return so as to lead it to the limits of the representable, thinkable, tenable. The connection between questioning and retrospective return is articulated by Augustine in a phrase equally important to Arendt: I have become a question to myself. To Kristeva, this is going in quest of oneself, a return to the most interior, intimus. However, with modern man, retrospective return is not a simple reprise of the retrospective link that founds the innermost recesses of the Christian man, serene in his quest, which is completed by a return to the summum esse. Certain advances in the culture of the 20th century have led retrospective return to the limits of the representable, thinkable, tenable, to irreconcilable conflict. Arendt has missed this. She lauded the Augustinian palace of memory, but has not recognized the Freudian one, in which the return of man to his innermost recesses comes to the very limit of the energetic hermeneutic heterogeneity. This limit is Freud's Zeitlos, the timeless, which is, first, the unconscious wish that is unaware of time, but then advances to the timeless that Freud called the death drive. The thought of retrospective return allows Kristeva to propose that in the death drive, psychoanalysis offers an unprecedented concept of time that allows us to grasp the psychical from the limits of a break in the time of life and consciousness, time unbound. Psychoanalysis presents psychical life and death from the unity of meaning and being conscious to the domain of images and the register of embodied speech to the other side of this register, the pre-psychical. Revolt attains the border region of the speaking being, risking the psychical reality that endangers consciousness. Questioning and revolt therefore have their own morbid dead ends, yet only relentlessly repeating retrospective return, reuniting with affect through the metaphorical and metanymical rifts of discourse, can counter the unquestioned positivity of values and the eradication of thinking. To Kristeva, modern writing seeks a language, a thought, a style for a confrontation with the unity of meaning. Unfolding meaning to the point of sensations and drives, modern writing traverses evil to accede to a jouissance in an experiment in psychosis. The limits of the representable, thinkable, tenable are inscribed in modern writing that is finding its pulse in a realm that is no longer symbolic but semiotic. The pulse of meaning in writing and literature is taken to a border region where the indestructible drive, time unbound, enjoins dangerously the life of the mind, thought and language. Modern literature engages the crossroads of life and death, time and the timeless. To Kristeva, then, the question of what motility remains to the subject vis-a-vis the dead ends of modernity is still a matter of what is most alive and promising in our culture. Life that assumes the radical inner experience where pre-verbal sensations and images sensorialize the life of the mind. Kristeva can thus affirm Arendt's life of the mind, which develops the philosophical tradition of interiority in Kant and Hegel, as well as her concept of action, whose meaning is put into a narrative. What Arendt missed is the Freudian palace of memory, the domain of the unconscious. For her, action is a new beginning that reveals the unique, distinct person, their living essence, and creates a new relationship in the web of human relationships. This requires the storyteller, who alone perceives the unique meaning of the action and puts it into a narrative. Kristeva's writer is more inwardly turned, more aware of the fractures and fault lines in the semiotics of the tale. This suggests that no easy transition from narrative to action, in the sense of Arendt's political writings, is possible. Kristeva can thus affirm Arendt's veritable politics of narration, but not any veritable politics of action. A different critique of Arendt is offered by Gillian Rose in The Broken Middle. Rose sustains the role of action by rejecting any fixed opposition between the social and the political. She returns action to an historical and social problematic that enigmatically divides moral agency and social action in the modern subject. This splits the self-identity of the subject differently than the psychoanalytic splitting in the heterogeneity of drive-in meeting. The relation between the two cannot be directly represented, but is not therefore to be abandoned. The view of action that comes with Rose's criticism of Arendt constitutes what I will call a chiasmus with Kristeva. Rose takes social and political experience to apparatic existence, where we find the split in the subject between moral agent and social actor. This adopts Hegel's way of returning Kant's abstract dichotomy of autonomy and heteronomy to experience. The split in the modern subject is one between the inner autonomy of moral intentions and the outer heteronomy of public conduct. It appears against a background problem formulated in Marx in On the Jewish Question. Marx writes, "The perfection of idealism of the state was at the same time the perfection of the materialism of civil society. The shaking off of the bonds which held in check the egoistic spirit of civil society. Political emancipation from the pre-modern political yoke was at the same time the emancipation of civil society from politics, from even the illusion shine of a universal content." Marx here grasps the historical diremption of civil society and the state, and the mutual implication. The new modern state is the illusion of a universal content, appearing in the formal equality of legal persons, which mismatches actual inequality, competition, and exploitation in civil society. Rose appropriates this critical framework without, however, denouncing the social and developing another universal content opposed to it. Instead, she calls for the experience of the social and the political in each other, in conditions of the historical diremption and mutual implication of civil society and the state. In these conditions, the subject is socialized into a split between inner moral autonomy on the one hand and, on the other, the outer heteronomy of public conduct and the institutions of civil society. Autonomy and heteronomy are the inner and outer boundaries of the subject's self-identity, which cannot be reconciled. Moral and social experience therefore takes the form of the inversions of experience, which Rose calls the inversions of intentions and institutions. The inner autonomy of thinking and moral motivation initiates action in which the subject moves her outer boundary in public conduct, only to discover her participation in heteronomous institutions in civil society, dominated by the means-end category. Her initiative, which began in moral intentions, turns into participation in the treatment of others and herself as a means to the ends of private and civic interests. She is sent back to the inner boundary of her self-identity, the freedom of thinking and moral motivation, where the illusion of a universal content is active. In these inversions, we discover that things never turn out to be as they were in the beginning, that we can find no satisfaction, that there is no place for subjective freedom. This actual self, subjective freedom as act and actual existence, does not result. However, with Rose, this does not mean lack of a place, and so idealized place or utopia. Rather, it is aporia, lack of a way, which is pre-logical and implies no exit from this condition. Yet, aporia is not without plasticity and motility. The inversions of experience are multiple and open-ended. Rose does not oppose the social and the political then. She brings them together in an apparatic existence that can come to recognize the double danger of inner moral intentions and outer public conduct. She critiques positions that recognize only one danger. For example, either moral judgment that opposes itself to political will, known to have ended up in the culture of terror, or political will that opposes itself to moral judgment that does not act. Both dangers fail to recognize the double danger of inner moral intentions and outer public conduct. Rose is especially concerned with critiquing not only political idealism, but also the danger that follows thwarted moral intentions, the withdrawal from action that intensifies the fatality of thinking and moral motivation, what Hegel called being for self. This cuts the Arendtian two-in-one off from the bonds with the significations of values of the culture that, to cite Kristeva, it would question, thereby isolating it in impotent inwardness. Rose therefore affirms the inversions of experience over the danger of conscience-stricken inwardness. She affirms the authorships that recognize the double danger and maintain the anxiety of being rather than, and maintain the anxiety of beginning rather than erecting or falling in with the insinuated authorities of their culture. These are lives and authorships that both struggle with their culture and let it be. Her critical point is that an authorship inhibits recognition of history and arrests movement when it substitutes either moral judgment that does not act or political idealism for anxiety of beginning. This is ultimately her criticism of Arendt's dichotomy of the social and the political. Rose follows the inversions of intentions and institutions in this period to their most sinister conclusion. Her book, Judaism and Modernity, is attentive to Arendt's report on the Eichmann trial, but she finds that Arendt merged her judgment of Eichmann's crime with her discernment of the reason for it, absent of thinking. This moral judgment is the counterpart to her political idealism. Rose separates the reason for Eichmann's crime, absence of thinking, from Arendt's judgment on this reason. To Rose, if the discovery and everyday experience of the cruelties of civil society can lead to an effort to maintain inner thinking and conscience, and opposition to outer passivity in public conduct, this opposition is itself capable of the inversion that grasps the ordinary man argument from Hannah Arendt and Christopher Browning. The mass murder and routine become one. Inner passivity, the absence of thinking, accompanies outer activity, public conduct, and the performance of atrocities. The double danger of conscience-stricken inwardness and colluding social action can be found again in the aftermath of atrocities, precisely at a site preserved for full acknowledgement of what happened. The visitor to the site of Auschwitz can be induced by its arrangement into national pavilions to alternate between identifying herself in pain with the victims and in intense self-questioning regarding the possibility of having counted amongst the perpetrators. These identifications represent what could be juxtaposed in the period to that site that memorializes. I'm all nervous now. The impotent inwardness of conscience and atrocities in public conduct. Rose suggests that the inducement to these mute identifications be replaced by a question that would, instead, initiate discussion. How easily could we have allowed this to be carried out? The discussion would involve a questioning of European identities. Such questioning implies that the relation between the inner and outer boundaries of our self-identity and lack of self-identity turns us into strangers to ourselves as moral agents and social actors. Questioning identity might contribute to a change in awareness regarding the relation between different oppositions. Innocence and might, authority and force, are inner and outer boundaries. This encounter with strangeness allows for what is most vital in the authorships that Rose affirms. A third may appear in the inversions of experience, which cannot be posited, is not revealed or known. An interstitial self comes out of and approaches the unknown third as a space between the potentiality and actuality of the world. The interstitial self fails toward unknown worlds, engages and risks itself at the point where the potentiality and actuality of the world may come into a changed relation. Rose therefore puts the unknown at the heart of motility, of lives and authorships that will not escape the inversions of experience, yet have sources in unknown worlds. This is political risk for Rose. We may now make good on the claim that the chiasmus is a good way to figure the relationship between Kristeva and Rose. Chiasmus is a grammatical figure in which the order of words in one clause is reversed in the other clause. The words do not have the same meaning in the two clauses, so the chiasmus is neither a proposition of identity, nor can it properly form a contradiction. Rather, a seeming contradiction, which is an overfamiliar abstraction, is transformed into principles of social criticism through the figure of chiasmus. For purposes of illumination, we may take an example from Horkheimer and Adorno, who overcame the abstract contradiction of myth and enlightenment in the chiasmus. Myth already entails enlightenment. Enlightenment reverts to myth. In the first clause, myth is already a kind of rationality constituted by the strengthening of a self in mastering mythic powers. Odysseus. In the second clause, enlightenment reverts to myth. Enlightenment is not identified with the mythical world. Rather, the enlightened world repeats the irrational powers that it sought to escape in pushing myth into the past. Enlightenment repeats irrational powers in the rational domination of the subject of her nature. The chiasmus formulates compulsion, repetition in a historical and social actuality. The chiasmus I propose for Rose and Kristeva is this. In the life and consciousness of action, we are already strangers to ourselves. Strangers to ourselves. In revolt, we advance to the break in life and consciousness. The chiasmus inhibits the abstract opposition of action and inaction. It develops the equivocation over the worlds of action and revolt to the point where we can see their indefinite relation. The phrase, strangers to ourselves, is fleetingly an indeterminate moment that is driven through in order to maintain the relation. That we are strangers to ourselves is common to both Rosian action and Kristevan revolt, but cannot be held in common. In the first clause, the supposed stability of life and consciousness, unitary meaning in the known world of modern social and political experience, is already undone in the world of action. We are strangers to ourselves as moral agents and social actors. In the second clause, we are strangers to ourselves in psychical life, a radical inner experience essential to revolt. The chiasmus, therefore, gives us a lens through which to see the different approaches of Rose and Kristeva to the impasses of modernity and the motility that nonetheless remains to the modern subject. It gives understanding its due as regards the indefinite relation between action and revolt. Finally, an image for the chiasmus. Rose chose a maze design by Greg Bright for the cover of her book. I refer to its four corners. The star of redemption releases the threads that crisscross the maze paths, separating and relating the public realm to the gates of the camp. The star does not stand above social and political experience, for its shape is repeated in the whole or part throughout the maze paths and yields to a lack of way. The configuration of star, gates, and world returns the idealized public realm to Diremption and the inversions of experience. A third appears at a point where the potentiality and actuality of the world may come into a changed relation, a gathered arrow whose word is wither, what may be ventured. At the same time, dark spots appear in the public realm, realities that might correspond to or foil the concentration of dark holes at the gates of the camp, the eradication of thinking in human beings, time unbound, and revolt engaging the crossroads of time and the timeless. However, we cannot directly conjoin what underlies the gathered arrow, the discovery that we are strangers to ourselves as moral agents and social actors, to revolt. The distinction and relation of the worlds of action and revolt cannot be grasped discursively. Rather than denouncing discursive comprehension, I have proposed that the relation between the worlds of action and revolt is indefinite, but nonetheless maintained in the grammatical figure of chiasmus.
We'll be in the interest of time and retrospective return, saving questions for the end. And our next talk.
Okay, so I'm Amy. Thank you all for being here. I just wanted to give a quick preface to the images that I'm working with. I'm working with the contemporary artist Kara Walker, who, as you may know, deals with quite traumatic material that's referencing slavery and racial violence. So to sort of preface that, I will not be discussing every image that I show. I'm merely giving some images throughout my talk to sort of give some context to what her work looks like, how it's evolved over time since the mid-90s. In the closing statements of his introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, Freud claims that if a knife does not cut, it cannot be used for healing either, thus indicating the intimate relationship between the analysan's encounter with repressed material and the capacity for psychical healing. Advancing Freud's assertion, I argued that the abject and alluring images of racial trauma and subjectivity that characterize the contemporary artwork of Kara Walker enact a visual return to the cultural repressed, that is, an aesthetic return to an unsymbolizable space that we may call, after Jacques Lacan, the real. By cutting into the extimate traumas of the real with her iconic cut paper silhouettes, Kara Walker inaugurates what I am describing as a Kristevan ethics of revolt, an intimate interrogation of an unspeakable past so as to give meaning to suffering, which I claim is inextricably linked to sublimation, desire, and the capacity for psychical rebirth. Working from Kristeva's trilogy on revolt, I analyzed the unsettling movements of Walker's artwork, emphasizing the ethical possibilities of her trauma aesthetic through which meaning is redressed in a kind of space of revolt. I propose that Walker's efforts to symbolize the unsymbolizable through a controlled chaos initiate an ethics of revolt and desire that makes possible a future of psychical rebirth. Although Walker frequently uses collage, graphite, inks, and gouache watercolor, she's perhaps most famous for her galleries of larger-than-life cut paper silhouettes that beckon the spectator to see unspeakable scenes of subjection. Reconstructing haunting tableaus of the antebellum South, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow, Walker assembles unsettlingly provocative and purposefully ambiguous depictions of slavery, sexual assault, plantation life, cultural displacement, lynching violence, and racial stereotypes, uncovering with each chaotic landscape the continued repressions of racism and racial history in the United States. Cutting up remnants of the real with the fragile medium of paper, Walker thus summons the realities of a racial history through a calculated use of fantasy. Indeed, as Kevin Young has reminded us, the most misunderstood part of Walker's work is that she traffics in fantasy rather than some version of reality or even protest. Yet the abject fantasies that Walker constructs are always already emerging from the shadows of a tangible historical reality, as is evidenced in her most recent resignifications of lynching photographs. In this way, I'm interested in Walker's artwork as a form of revolt in the Kristevan sense. Working as Kristeva explains in Revolt, she said, from its etymology, meaning return, returning, discovering, uncovering, and renovating, but also rupturing, renewing. Indeed, Walker's galleries are revolting and even painfully violent, but this movement of returning and renewing is precisely what distinguishes her artwork as enacting an intimate ethics of revolt. For revolt, Kristeva clarifies, is not simply about rejection and destruction, but is also about starting over. Unlike the word violence, revolt foregrounds an element of renewal and regeneration. Walker's intimate return to a revolting history of racial violence is thus a concurrent movement of rupturing and renewing, though her intricate aesthetic is accomplished with a seemingly simple medium, paper. These haunting galleries that flood the not only major museums, but the psyches of its spectators are often constructed upon nothing more than black paper and the handiwork of an X-Acto knife, carving out fantastical figures and landscapes that agglomerate within an abstract space without definable limits, borders, or time. And we just heard from Robert's piece on white space as a sort of timelessness that these silhouettes are caught in. With an intended association to cartoons as well as anonymity, Walker's simplified technique of cut paper silhouettes renders complex narratives and imaginaries within the thin, fragile frame of each silhouette shape. Like a haunting abyss or a lingering shadow, Walker's silhouettes, a craft once termed shadow portraits in the 19th century, are at once both deep as a black void and shallow as the paper itself. Moreover, her use of the silhouette form itself may be read as an artistic returning to a technique that once captivated the same cultural milieu that endorsed slavery. Walker's revitalized technique can perhaps be conceptualized through a passage from Kristeva's recent work, The Severed Head, in which she describes the role of the female artist, a description that reflects my own reading of Walker as cutting into the latent traumas of racial being in the world. And this is a sort of lengthy quote from The Severed Head. Kristeva writes, "It is easy to cut up a woman's body if you're a woman. You know it so well. You know how to set it about, which flap of skin to lift off, which joint to go for, which bit of cartilage to destroy. You know what shame to awaken, what suffering to revive, what susceptibility to trample on, what jealousy to exacerbate, what longing to thwart, what desire to frustrate, what death to repeat, to go on repeating endlessly, not letting the pain ever ease. You're attacking yourself, but from a distance. You protect yourself and survive while the other dies, disappears into the void to which she seems always to have belonged. You yourself are reborn, set off. What might seem like carnage is merely the act of a surgeon. In Seeing the Unspeakable, art historian Gwendolyn Du Bois Shaw describes Walker's artwork as a haunting visualization of the disturbing rememories of the personal and collective trauma of slavery. However, Walker's artistic rehistoricization of racial trauma moves beyond these pains of our political history in order to unveil what remains an unquestioned legacy of cultural violence. In doing so, Walker not only exposes latent cultural imaginaries regarding race, gender, sexuality, and desire, but also produces an aesthetic space of revolt in which there is a potential to give meaning to suffering. Walker's unsettling return to the repressed may thus be read as an attempt to articulate unarticulable experiences of devastation, an ethical act of what Saadia Hartman calls redress, or to quote, the exercise of agency directed toward the release of the pained body, the reconstitution of violated natality, and the remembrance of breach. This is to say that Walker's artistic articulation of loss assumes a politics of redress, whereby the unsymbolizable conditions of the past are approached precisely for the purpose of establishing a future of meaning. Moreover, one might argue that Walker's artistic revolution lies in her capacity to surface and redress unspeakable traumas that are indeed localized in the threshold of the psychic and the social. And this next image is quite traumatic. It was actually, Walker had installed this in a space of the public library. I forget which city it was in, but it was quickly veiled by a sort of cloth.
Is it going to be a photo? I just want to.
It's not a photo. It's actually like the center image is graphite. So if you don't want to look, you do not have to. At the heart of Walker's trauma aesthetic lies the extimate real, which Lacan describes in Seminar 2 as the something with which all words cease and all categories fail. The real, according to Lacan, is that which escapes or is outside of language and remains a kind of absent center in the psyche, thereby rendering it unsymbolizable, albeit an intrinsic component of psychic life. Often the real is conceptualized in terms of trauma that is both inaccessible and unarticulable. In this way, it is impossible for Walker's artwork to actually represent or reproduce the real, because the real is opposed to the imaginary and beyond the symbolic, though her images of loss and desire nonetheless cut deeply into its totality and vanished instant. For Lacan, the real is precisely what underpins the structure of psychic life, insofar as the trace of memorial loss resides within the psyche as an absent center around which the subject perpetually revolves. Of course, Lacan's theory of the real is not necessarily Kristeva's, but we might say in Kristevan terms that the real may be understood as an overwhelming black sun that bears the potential to collapse meaning and therefore psychic life. The real is thus described by Lacan in Seminar 7 as extimate, which is not the opposite of intimate, but rather is the quality of being both inside as well as outside. Like the unconscious or even the dream, the extimate real is that trauma, that absent center within the subject that is simultaneously the most intimate, the most personal, but also the most external, the most hidden or opaque. By cutting into this trauma, this elusive space that is the extimate real, Walker's artistic return serves not simply to unearth a cultural repression of racial trauma, but to draw the spectator into an intimate space of thought and questioning. I argue then that Walker's artwork initiates a kind of encounter with the real, or what Lacan calls the 2K, whereby the spectator is pulled into a revolting derivative of the real. Derived from Aristotle's brush with the 2K, or fortune, chance, luck, Lacan defines the 2K as a kind of brush with the real, which he claims is beyond the return and lies behind the fantasy. Moreover, French scholar Sara Kay indicates that the origins of Aristotle's 2K refer to the unthought within thought, and that which takes place in the gaps and is outside reason and unarticulable. Indeed, Walker's artistic resignification of racial trauma articulates visually the 2K as described by Lacan in Seminar 11 as the real as encounter. The real insofar as it may be missed, insofar as it is essentially the missed encounter. Not unlike the structured setting of analysis, Walker's trauma aesthetic functions as a space of controlled chaos in which the spectator encounters the real as essentially missed, or perhaps only in tiny bits. Perhaps the value of in stressing Walker's artwork as exhibiting the 2K is that her silhouettes, for example, conjure the real to surface within its cut-out void, yet maintain a certain distance between the subject and the real through her technique's essentially mixed encounter. In this way, Walker's artwork provokes a disturbance in the spectator that beckons an endless questioning and working through of an unarticulable history, as well as one's relation to that history. I would add, however, that such working through is never simply completed in the sense of overcoming the past, but rather is an ongoing process of questioning that is essential to the renewals of psychic life. Thus, Walker's visual encounter with the real incites a remembering or redress that may be conceived as a kind of sublimatory revolt. In the Ethics of Psychoanalysis, Lacan reworks Freud's thought on sublimation as a redirection of the drive to an alternate object, declaring rather that sublimation is a process that, quote, raises an object to the dignity of the thing, such that the object that is relocated, such that the object is relocated to the place of the thing. What is significant about Lacan's enigmatic formula for reading Walker's artwork is that it articulates the intimate process through which the subject maintains a distance from the real, thereby enabling the subject's capacity for desire. Indeed, if it were possible for Walker to literally reproduce the real onto the gallery wall, it could mean the collapse of meaning altogether. And this is certainly the case when her artwork disturbs someone to the point of that. Walker displaces the real of racial trauma and produces a space of revolt, where the subject assumes a kind of distance from the place of the real. Although for Lacan, complete sublimation is not possible for the individual, Walker's artwork nevertheless functions as a sublimatory aesthetic revolt that plays on the ambiguity of fantasy and reality, such that the imaginary does not become wholly collapsed by the real, thereby opening up a space for an ongoing working through of the past to grant a future of meaning. This movement from the extimate trauma of the real to an intimate ethics realized in psychical revolt is precisely where I would argue Kristeva's thought can help illuminate the significance of Walker's artistic project. And these are the two images that I will deal with throughout the rest of the talk. I would now like to shift to a brief reading of one of Walker's most iconic works, her 1998 quasi-self-portrait aptly titled Cut. Created in an immediate response to the photograph on the left, of herself that appeared in Interview magazine and that arguably depicts Walker as a carefree contemporary artist, Cut exposes the struggles that Walker encounters as an African-American woman working as an artist in the United States. In Seeing the Unspeakable, Gwendolyn Shaw writes that Cut is an image of grotesque self-mutilation and ambiguous ecstasy that speaks to the self-creation of Walker's artistic persona and her attempt to control the discourse around her work. Indeed, as many scholars have pointed out, Cut visualizes the ongoing tension that Walker experiences as a woman of color, using art to challenge the ideological conditions of not only her profession, but her social and cultural milieu. And although Cut is not representative of Walker's work as a whole, it's a single image as opposed to a chaotic scene, and it's one of her only self-portraits, Cut does epitomize the psychical and existential tensions of trauma, identity, and desire that define her artistic landscape more generally. The artist's role, Kristeva declares in Revolt, she said, is not to make a faithful copy of reality, but to shape our attitude towards reality. This genuine act of revolt is not about domination or concealment, but about the interstice, about appropriating and being possessed, about the resonance between the self and the world. What appears to link Walker's imaginative return to trauma and her creation of an aesthetic space of fascination is precisely what resides in the middle, between the repulsive real and the captivating imaginary, pain. Pain is the psychical and existential sensation that lies within the thin, fragile borders of Walker's silhouettes, right where her X-Acto knife severed her landscapes, figures, and objects from the residual scraps that fell to the floor or were discarded as surplus. As a kind of trace of Walker's cutting into paper, pain borders the often jagged lines of her silhouette on the gallery wall. And pain is also what lies somewhere within her deep yet shallow voids. Indeed, if there was no pain driving Walker's trauma aesthetic, no experience of injury or devastation, then there would be no need for a distancing between the real and its spectators. On the surface, Cut depicts the temporal suspension of a silhouetted young woman who is caught in the air somewhere between a leap of ecstasy and a fatal descent. In an abject redoubling of her authorship, Walker assumes the agency of cutting herself up in order to stage her spectral image as having been incised by her own hands. Indeed, the paradoxical signification of a clicking of heels and the slitting of wrists captures the often unarticulable experience of what Lacan calls jouissance, an existential enjoyment that is inextricably linked to an experience of suffering, psychical suffering. In this way, Cut articulates the very condition which renders the image abject, that of ambiguity. By visualizing the concurrency of ascension and descension, Cut makes it impossible to read her silhouette specter as pure facticity or pure transcendence. In this way, Walker recasts her public image, as well as her desire to be taken seriously in the art world, as one of abject ambiguity that, not unlike the nature of trauma itself, resists any totalizing representation or symbolization. Cut thus visualizes the phenomenological structure of Walker's aesthetic revolt, inasmuch as Walker suspends her unashamed silhouette in the threshold of facticity and transcendence. On the one hand, the fatal descent envisioned in Cut represents Walker's relationship to her facticity and the traumas of racism and sexism that make up the past and its traces in memory. On the other hand, the leap of ecstasy in Cut represents Walker's relationship to her transcendence and the intimate revolt that catapults her into a future of meaning, desire, and redress. Like the fragile hinges of her silhouetted slit wrist, Walker resides within an unsevered threshold of facticity and transcendence that underscores the structure of her analytic revolt as tied to the rebirth of desire. This is to say that Cut symbolizes the very movement of an intimate revolt insofar as it depicts a transcendence that is always already comprised in its facticity. In other words, Cut is Walker's revolt into meaning and desire that is contingent upon her encounter with the real. And it is this relentless cutting into the real that constitutes Walker's return as an ethical revolt. As an unsettling ambiguity of facticity and transcendence, trauma and ecstasy, Cut immediately holds the gaze over the spectator by reordering the field of vision in order to catch its spectator in a moment of visual collapse. Cut thus functions as a kind of spectacle of the real that beckons and disturbs the spectator, thereby initiating a process of looking awry such that the subject, as Lacan says, is caught, manipulated, captured in the field of vision, and is literally called into the picture, which is especially the case when witnessing her large-scale cycloramas, such as the end of Uncle Tom, which was the first image, sort of called into the picture, and she sort of describes this in her interviews. Indeed, the visually captivating silhouette of Cut, embodying the real as encounter, signifies what Kristeva describes in Powers of Horror as a deep well of memory that is unapproachable and intimate. Walker's visual return to the cultural repressed thus positions the spectator as a analysand to not only summon the repressed and seemingly unapproachable histories of race and trauma, but also to question those histories through an ethical movement of anamnesis and revolt. One might say that Cut epitomizes Walker's ethics of desire inasmuch as it articulates visually a concurrent relationship to lack and illusion. Moreover, Cut emphasizes Walker's trauma aesthetic as a working through that incites the spectator, in the spectator, a desire for meaning over a destructive thoughtlessness. In Hatred and Forgiveness, Kristeva insists that the rebirth of psychic life necessitates a space of revolt in which frontiers and limits are indeed questioned, not transgressed. Reproducing the metonymic structure of desire, Walker's endless displacement of the past remains a vital space of aesthetic revolt and psychical rebirth. Throughout her trilogy on the power and limits of psychoanalysis, Kristeva wagers that the future, if it exists, depends on what she calls intimate revolt, which she identifies in the sense and nonsense of revolt, not in the sense of transgression, but in the logic of a return of the past, a retrieving of memory, and a working through that makes possible the renewal of psychic space. Kristevan revolt, read in terms of Walker's own aesthetic return to the past, may be understood as a displacement of the traumatism, a progressive, incessant, and perhaps even interminable displacement that grants the possibility of working out and working through. In Kristevan terms, Walker's artwork serves, not unlike analysis, as a controlled encounter with the real, a kind of turning back, through which there emerges an invitation to become the narrator of trauma as well as desire. This is precisely why Walker is read as sort of rehistoricizing the pains of political history. Mimicking the pulsative structure of the real, Kristevan revolt bears an intimate relationship to repetition, which is evidenced not only in Walker's recurrent use of the silhouette form as a literally paper-thin screen that borders the haunting specter of trauma, but also in her persistent return to the histories of racial oppression more generally. Indeed, Walker indicates that her artwork never leaves the past alone. Kristeva's psychoanalytic formulation of revolt suggests that a repetitious encounter with the past, and thus the real, is imperative for working through trauma and creating a future of meaning. Analytical revolt, Kristeva says, is an antidote to the threat of lost memory that she argues certain contemporary artists seem to perceive. To be sure, Walker's artistic project does precisely this, inasmuch as her return to the histories of racial objection signals a remembering of the lost memory of slavery and its lasting traumas. In her phantasmagoric scenes of an unsymbolizable memory of slavery, Walker's visual return to the repressed functions as an intimate ethics of revolt that puts not only the past into question, but subjectivity itself. Through her efforts to remember artistically the pains of our political and racial histories, Walker may be read as usurping the imaginary as an aesthetic space of revolt, where the psychical sutures of racial trauma might begin to come undone. Indeed, Walker's aesthetic revolt functions precisely as a return to and displacement of the past, through which a re-narration of history and a renewal of psychical life might emerge. For the subject as spectator, Walker's images of horror and desire function as remnants of the real through which trauma can be contained, even sublimated in the ambiguities of fantasy and reality, such that meaning is not fully subsumed in the real, and so that there remains a capacity for psychical rebirth and desire. Moreover, Walker's trauma aesthetic functions as a precise cutting up of the real that through imaginative fantasy maintains a certain distance between the spectator and the real. Walker's aesthetic revolt thus functions as a kind of ethics of desire by usurping the space of the imaginary so that, as Lacan puts it, the fantasy protects the real. It is within this ongoing process in which the imaginary borders the real that Walker articulates her artistic revolt as a redress of the past to give meaning to suffering. She recognizes the elusive materiality of the real, yet works at the level of the imaginary, thus reproducing a model of desire that feeds off both lack and illusion. This is to say that because Walker's artwork is rendered shamelessly abject, surfacing repressed traumas and desires surrounding race, gender, and sexuality, it beckons the spectator through repulsion and fascination into what Kristeva describes in The Severed Head as the flight of thought, so that the imaginary might serve to protect the subject from the real. In the opening of The Severed Head, Kristeva declares that the image is potentially a space of freedom, insofar as the image bears the potential to incite the flight of thought and the wandering of imagination. I would argue then that Walker's images of repressed trauma and desire point us to the possibilities of the imaginary, through which the atrocities of our political history may begin to be redressed, thereby facilitating an endless working through and rebirth of psychic space. Faced with the invasion of the spectacle, Kristeva argues in Intimate Revolt, we can still contemplate the rebellious potentialities that the imaginary might resuscitate in our innermost depths. It is precisely within these unsettling imaginaries that Walker asks us to think. For if Walker's trauma aesthetic takes us to the extimate, from the extimate horrors of the real to the intimate limits of subjectivity, then it is precisely out of the hope that, as Kristeva suggests, we may never forget to think, to wander, to question, to revolt. Thank you.
Next up is Bethany Henning's Ezekiel 7 and the permanent, the permanent efficacy of grace. And we're running rather over, but I think we can go over with questions a bit. It's currently 11:26.
I'll read fast.
I'm sorry for the.
I'm going to stand because I have allergies and I need the breath to get it out. So, here we go. The occasion that inspired this paper was the hearing of a song. It was 1 year ago when I was made to listen to John Darnielle's song, Ezekiel 7 and the Permanent Efficacy of Grace. John Darnielle's voice is not exactly mellifluous. In fact, it's abrasive, nasal and grating. Despite his undeniable gift for songwriting, I have never had enough patience with his voice to give John Darnielle or his band, the Mountain Goats, any serious consideration until I heard Ezekiel 7. The quiet, intricate composition captivated me so that I was haunted for days by this voiced song whose lyrics and arrangement allow the listener to hear the fragmenting ends of unraveling subjectivity. What becomes of the subject that is threatened with dissolution by the drive? How can we imagine the moment that follows the interruption of life by the timelessness of death? What is there to counter or quell negativity such that psychic space can be reestablished? In the following paper, I will be pursuing a line of Kristevan thinking that points us in the direction of an aesthetic experience that may provide pathways for the imagination to live. Borrowing from her work on Revolt and Jouissance, from Intimate Revolt, and her discovery of the semiotic capacities that give rise to psychic space in Tales of Love, I will contend that the violence of the drives that threatens the subject with collapse is not refused, but is rather inscribed in artistic forms. I take the musical experience of the song as the exemplary demonstration of the semiotically charged form. The voiced song can recall us to a sensory intimacy that could replenish subjectivity, even as it is threatened with the violence of drive and the deracination of a robotizing and spectacular society that tends to bury or deny the life of drives. The book of Ezekiel is a profoundly unsettling biblical moment. It is a voyage through defilement, miasma, and ruin. Although Ezekiel, like the other prophets, foretells the restoration of Zion, such promises only follow horrific devastation that God will rain down upon Israel as punishment for breaking holiness laws. When Ezekiel began having visions, he was living in an exile imposed by the Babylonians. God appears to Ezekiel in a storm that sweeps in from the direction of Jerusalem, loins gleaming, accompanied by a cherubim, and commands him to eat a scroll so that he may incorporate the word of God and be able to recite it accurately to the house of Israel. Ezekiel then testifies to the pitiless wrath of God. Israel's punishments for accepting the authority of the Babylonians in the Holy Land will include the sending of wild animals to consume them, including the children of the righteous, the public stoning, shaming, and cutting to pieces of the Israelites, the way one would punish an adulterous woman, and a famine that will see parents and children cannibalizing one another. With excruciating detail, Ezekiel reveals the vengeful God and his awesome wrath, the God of pain and power put in the place of that most instinctual of instincts, the death drive. The time of death is a non-temporalizing time. It is a breach in the life of the subject, a time devoid of becoming. Death is an interruption of the psychic linear time by the timeless unconscious because it encroaches on a pre-psychical time and approaches the somatic. The drive of destruction let loose into the life wrecks the body, desolates it until it is mere body. As Kristeva puts it, biology itself is accompanied by thanatology. God's destruction of Israel is not absolute. He promises to leave some alive, scattered throughout the nations as a reminder of his power and his law. In short, Ezekiel's God is a torturer and humiliates Israel. He reduces the rebellious nation to naked imminence. We must not pretend that such horrors are contained safe within the ancient mythological world, though they do not often find expression in everyday legal or political discourses. Though they are neglected by most mainstream news sources, torture persists among the exiled and throughout the borderlands of nations whose continuing conflicts have long been hidden in the folds of routine, in the routine of ordinary modern life. Tortured bodies are those that are caught in the clash between the letter of the law of nations, the inescapable needs of the body, and the urgency of the national ideal that demands to be realized. The timeless dispute that is played out between Babylon, Israel, and the God of death in Ezekiel repeats itself today between the United States, Mexico, and addiction. What lasting traces of excitation remain trapped below the level of representation, beneath the level of discourse? What trapped and so unsymbolizable affects to form ordinary life as robotizing society continues to push to transform the subject into the patrimonial person? And how might one recover these experiences from the threshold life such that the body becomes rich with meaning, a site for jouissance once again? Although the border between the United States and Mexico has been contested for centuries, in the last several decades, the peculiarities of the borderlands have manifested grisly scenes of death and torture, barely comprehensible casualties at the intersections of NAFTA, poverty, and the war on drugs. Although we are unprepared to process most of these injuries on the political level or in the public sphere, they are nevertheless making their way into our cultural imaginary as we attempt to come to terms with the deformities of ordinary life that result from violent practice and lead into it. Life in some Mexican communities, particularly those at the borderlands, is surrounded and sustained by a steady appetite for drugs in the United States. Although cocaine, heroin, and other narcotics have been flowing north prior to the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1994, the Mexican economy, dramatically altered by NAFTA, has come to lean on the reliable income from the powerful drug cartels. After the national economy collapsed in the 80s, the new economic partnership effectively replaced many Mexican industries and prevented new companies from developing. There are the American-owned clothing factories that primarily employ women, called maquiladoras, but these pay workers nearly unlivable wages and have resulted in numerous uninvestigated rapes and murders on the borderlands. The fruits of agricultural labor could no longer secure living wages in the age of integrated hemispheric trade. In some, the impoverished communities, both urban and rural, were forced to turn to another market that guaranteed the inflow of capital. Against the backdrop of poverty and powerlessness, a hopeful new heroic figure emerged between desperation and salvation. The narco-trafficker is one part gangster, one part cowboy, sanctified by a kind of Robin Hood mythology that finds expression in artifacts, icons, and folk music across Michoacan, Juarez, and Culiacan, as well as Southern California, New Mexico, and Arizona. The trafficker seems powerful beyond the anguish of poverty because he has the protection and support of a cartel that is more powerful and often legitimated by more authority than any government official. The narco-trafficker has money and influence, drives expensive cars, wears stylish clothes, and exudes an air of confidence. In short, he is the embodiment of machismo. The narco-trafficker is idolized in Mexico, not necessarily for his own particular deeds and contributions, but because he is what Mark Edberg, in his anthropological study on narco-traffickers, calls a cultural persona, a culturally shaped and flexible public representation that persists over time and is embodied as a person and iterations of that person. Citing Bordeaux, Edberg argues that the images surrounding the narco-trafficker come to compromise a bodily hexis that is taken from the model presented by the narco-trafficker, making the cultural persona available and practice and representation for individuals to form a self out of. In his research, Edberg analyzes the narco-corrida as one of the most effective deployments of the narco-trafficker persona. The narco-corrida form is only a few decades old, but it has emerged from the much older corrida, a danceable Mexican ballad that celebrates the story of a folk hero, often from the Mexican War of Independence or the Mexican Revolution. Recently, this form has been modified to celebrate narco-trafficking heroes, such as Jesus Malverde, the fabled narco-saint who has his own chapel in Culiacan. The narco-corrida is a very popular and heavily marketed fantasy of Mexican identity. In other words, the narco-trafficker's powerful gestalt becomes available as a kind of imago, in the troubling Lacanian sense, for borderland subjectivity. It is a fantasy of mastery through which one might project oneself imaginatively and visually into the future. The narco-trafficker persona is a fantasy of completeness that is entirely at odds with the poverty and instability of ordinary life at the hands of the state mechanisms. Functioning like the imago, identifications with the narco-trafficker instantiate the subject into an illusory world where relations with others are plagued by misrecognitions, aggressive impulses which arise as the ego jealously guards its power. If encounters with others are structured by such identifications, they will be given over to contests over essential and inessential being. This complex idealization conceals the grim complexity of the narco-trafficker's role in the community and leaves unquestioned their contribution to ordinary life. Narco-trafficking necessarily involves the violent practices in the forms of threats, murder, and torture. The last of these is a world-destroying activity that Jean Emery called the permanent breaking of the subject's trust in the world, as one's body is reduced, following Bernstein, to the extreme limit of the involuntary body, to the near body, at the hands of another who assumes the position of the absolute sovereign over another in the manipulation of pain. Torture exposes the condition of the human being as absolutely helpless before others and exploits it by dissolving the trust that makes vulnerability livable. The narco-trafficker standing in the world, that which makes him such a draw for idealization, as the occasion for the narco-corrida, is deformed by the grisly reality that his standing is illusory in the Lacanian sense, and is only gained by the destruction of the possibility of the standing of another. Notwithstanding the need for further questioning of the process and function of torture, our focus here is on the role of musical enactments in relation to this phenomenon of idealization composing Borderlands experience. I am concerned with the question of musical enactments that draw our affective life into meaningful exchanges. If music in the form of the narco corrida may draw one into the fantasy of power, sovereignty, and heroism, then another enactment may reveal the deformity that is hidden beneath the celebration. Like the narco corrida, John Darnielle's Ezekiel 7 and the Permanent Efficacy of Grace recounts the story of a journeying narco-trafficker. He offers us a glimpse of the torturer's relation to his victim, advancing us to the break in the torturer's consciousness and life, and translating it into song. John Darnielle is a folk musician, prolific poet, and has lived and written in Southern California. He has been outspoken about his continuing recovery from heroin addiction and personal history with physical abuse. I do not have time to detail his comments about them here, but his biography does help throw some interpretive light on the song we are about to hear. However, I would like to preface our listening with some comments about the role of music in psychical life. In Tales of Love, Kristeva theorizes that the not yet subject creates a space for the ego through an objectless and immediate affective transfer towards an indistinct otherness that offers the promise of meaning. A captivating presence whose iterations in artistic and musical experience establish the space for fantasy, for the imagination. Although I do not wish to linger over the loving third here, I do think musical experiences can induce a transfer to the place of the other such that the fragmented body coheres as it establishes psychic space. The same transference that is necessary to analytic experiences is also vital for aesthetic experiences. A successful song moves the listener because it inscribes the affects, the somatic energies that ripple on the level of the body, in voice, and draws them into coherent forms such that they can be explored by the subject from a safe distance. However, our interest in Ezekiel 7 is in the way in which it locates and comes to meet the effective remnant of political devastation that is covered over by the narco corrida and unreachable in political discourse. The effective remnant appears in Tales of Love as the longing of affect for the absolute meaning that shies away. Rather than distance being a given of the aesthetic form that comes to meet the fragmented drives and affects of the borderland experience, it can only arise in and through the song's inscription of the political remnant of devastation.
The clouds explode, and then the desert bloom. Someone will need to mop this floor for me. When I emerge, I find my car. Like a cathedral in a dream of the future. Drive till the rain stops. Keep driving. And blast on when I get the chance. Clear as an insect's wing in sunlight. Flip on the high stakes radio. Try to sing the words right. Drive till the rain stops. Keep driving.
had his arms tied up behind him. We were together all day. Maybe make Culiacan by sundown. Try to anyway. High as the clouds now, flying. Drive till the rain stops. Keep driving.
There is a chapel in Culiacan, a shrine dedicated to the memory of Jesus Malverde, the so-called narco-saint. Malverde is unrecognized by the Roman Catholic Church, but extremely important to Mexican culture. Miracles have been attributed to this early narco-trafficker. We can only speculate as to how often modern-day narco-traffickers visit the sanctuary, and, if they did, as to the contents of their prayers. Like the narco corrida, Darnielle's song provides a narrative of the narco-trafficker, but not for the purposes of celebration. Instead, he calls forth the intimate experience of the narco-trafficker immediately after he has finished torturing a victim. We do not know the identities of the torturer or the tortured, and the specific details of the deeds are not disclosed. As we have been watching Darnielle perform his song on an empty stage in an apparently vacant room, the camera has been circling his solitary form at the piano. During the final verse, we come in for an extreme close-up so that we can watch Darnielle's face as he sings his final lines. We are drawn in by his gestures, the sub-voluntary shudders of his body as he struggles to draw the necessary breath and strength to sing the final short line. In sum, the affect of political, moral, and intimate devastation that sustains and deforms our ordinary life is recovered for psychic space as jouissance, as the sensory pleasure of hearing what is devastatingly beautiful. I can now justify my fascination with the song and why I thought it proper to analyze here. Ezekiel 7 exposes us to the kind of experience that modern life aims to suppress in the interest of efficiency in the name of production for the sake of the patrimonial person whose temporality turns life into a life governed by the demand for the efficient production, profit, and consumption bought with devastation. Darnielle's song presents us with a kind of self-questioning that exposes us to the timeless drive. We verge on a psychical reality that endangers the subject, exposes it to the pulse of meaning. As threatening as this is, it can be at the very heart of the revolt that can open psychical life to its recreation, given the displacement of drive in writing and art. The material of Darnielle's body, the semiotic charge of affect, is indispensable to his performance and to the way the song resonates with us. The narco corrida gives us the moment of fantasy overtaken by idealization. But fantasy and the moment of the semiotic body as it is drawn into coherence through imagination without idealization can be a renewal of psychic life. Darnielle's song awakens us to the heterogeneity of meaning at work that other representations may cover. His voice gives us an inscription of borderland life. Darnielle's song draws the break in consciousness through the stirring of an affect that awakens us to the defilement that occurs on the borderlands between the U.S. and Mexico and draws our attention to the way in which ordinary life in North America is deformed by it. It reaches the affect that was previously trapped beneath the level of discourse and inscribes it within the excesses of the song, through which we recover the experiences that are otherwise occluded in our public discourses. Listening to the voice song is nothing short of a direct transmission of jouissance that can restore us to a more intimate sense of our world. The imagination is recovered once again, or temporarily. with its manifold capacities for covering the world and the body is meaningful. Work like Darnielle's retrieves the ordinary body that has been suppressed or denied by the modern evasions of affect, and awakens it to the drive that has threatened it all along in its ordinariness, recovering it for the work of the imagination and the replenishment of the union.
So I think we can allow ourselves 5 to 10 minutes over. We have a 2-hour lunch period, so if people need to leave, then of course that makes sense. But I'll take questions for. I don't know if we should go in order or.
Some support, yeah.
Yes, excellent. Yes, in the back.
Thank you for those talks. I enjoyed them a lot. My question is for Amy Stewart. And I wanted to ask you about the cut, that piece specifically, but also about that piece as perhaps representative of something that I was barely glimpsed when I saw the rest of her work, of Walker's work. So I can't help but see that piece left to right, meaning my head moves left to right, and my eyes go left to right. They go from the photograph to the cut. They don't go from the cut or the cutout to the photograph. They go from the photograph to the cut. And maybe that is because of my habits of reading. I read left to right. So I want to talk, I guess my question is about that. It's about that move that I make from left to right and seeing that piece of art, and also the way in which I was reading, so to speak, her other artwork, which also seems to be asking for a certain direction, left to right.
Okay.
Particularly the piece that is kind of semicircle.
Okay.
The first piece.
Right.
Sure.
Yes.
To me, called for that kind of reading, left to right. So, going back to the cut read this way then would be, it would go from perspective of the photograph to the flatness of the cutout, from the hand and the sleeve in the photograph to the cut of the wrist, from the individual of the photograph to the shadow of the cutout, from what appears to be like a look in the photograph, a kind of look of innocence, a look that seems to look for the viewer to look at her in a kind of support. From that kind of look in the photograph to an object that is seeing us, is not asking for us to see the object, the cutout is seeing us as if it were the cut in the eye, in the ocular organ, seeing us. And I wonder if you make anything of that move, that direction,
Okay. Yeah.
that goes from the photograph to the cutout, from the maybe what could be described as the symbolic form of signification to the semiotic form of signification, and not the other way around. Not from the semiotic way of signification to the symbolic, but from the symbolic form of signification. Did you make anything of that particular movement?
Well, the quickest answer is that when I put the slides together, when I've sort of explained the cut, her artwork in general, I had never had that image put with it. And so people were just like, I'm not really getting the context here, right? And so in that image of her, Walker herself, that image wasn't possible to find online. It's actually, you can't Google it for some reason. So, but it is in a collection that I have so I just scanned it and just sort of put it on the PowerPoint. And so honestly, the sort of left to right direction of that slide in particular, from the photo to the silhouette, like you were saying, the individual to the shadow, that's very much a sort of the coincidence of putting them side by side in order to give a contextualization of her silhouette.
So that's what you did.
So that is something I did, yes.
So that
So maybe there's
that
an
doesn't
unconscious thing
negate
going on there, I don't know.
question. I mean, what's
But
the meaning perhaps of that?
well, I would say in terms of like the cycloramas, because a lot of her images, for instance, there's one called Slavery, Slavery, and it is literally a full circle with a tiny gap where you walk in the gallery, walk out, and there's no windows, there's nothing else. It's all white space, black silhouettes, and there's nothing else. And in interviews, she's very clear. She does not want, well, you know, you can't really say what the spectator is going to think about your artwork, but she's not necessarily putting her artwork together to be read directionally left to right or right to left. She wants you to be caught. She wants you to get lost in the timelessness of the white space and its in the way those silhouettes are sort of hung and they just are stuck there in that dead space. And so in that way, I would say this, and I'm more familiar with her cycloramas, and I've visited her galleries, and in my own, you know, affective experience of seeing her work, I can't find myself going in one direction or another. I'm lost, and I'm captivated. And so that would be my answer in terms of direction. But it's a very interesting conception. Thanks.
My question is to Sara
I'll
Beardsworth.
try.
Although I don't know, maybe it could be a very long question, but it could, I believe, be answered also very shortly. I find this reading terrific of Kristeva and Rose. This chiasmic reading is absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much. It's great. What I was always wondering about, because whatever Arendt did, rightly or wrongly, she did confront the great political problem of her own time and of her own life. And then Rawls does the same thing, although much later, in terms of what is the European experience of this upheaval.
Yes.
But with Kristeva, there seems to be a very elaborate evasion of the revolution with which she was indoctrinated until the age of 24, when she left for Paris.
Yes.
Because revolution was the iconic, the basic article of faith with which East Europeans grew up and lived day after day. So what she does after leaving, first of all, she goes to modernism and the revolution in poetic language, which curiously it also connects to political resistance in Eastern Europe already in communist times. So to the revolution of the official dogma, the revolution in poetic language was very much perceived as sort of a way of resisting it. And then she goes into all these next developments in terms of what a revolution or revolt means. So my question simply is, don't you find it striking? Because there is a very careful evasion of this huge problem, which involved billions of a lot of people. If we count China, I mean, this is a lot of people. The communist experiment and the communist revolution, it involved a huge part of humanity, and it is so carefully avoided.
Avoided. I'm not quite sure what it is you want to imply about avoided. But what I was trying to do, because Rose was actually my director when I was working on Kristeva, so there was a lot of tension. And what I was trying to do was take up this moment in Rose where she's actually, it's a very cut paper. She was reading Rosa Luxemburg.
Oh.
And it's Rosa Luxemburg, incipient critique of the Diremption of German social democracy and Russian Revolution in that period. It's to recognize it as Diremption, which Rosa Luxemburg comes very close to but doesn't quite. But she does have a criticism of both trade unionism that is gradual reform, that is complicit with the corruption that it disdains, the corruption of civic mores, and the problem of political will, Leninism basically, that puts collective will in the place of anxiety or beginning, and then makes particular will, the party, represent collective will. And what I'm trying to do with the Rosian part of this, it's taken me a while to return to it, is see the degree in which political risk that she sees in Rahel Levin von Hagen and Rosa Luxemburg and Hannah Arendt as the anxiety of beginning that engages with their culture and struggles with it, but also lets it be. Yes.
Sarah?
Thanks. Thank you all for what were not only thoughtful but beautiful papers today. My question is, it has to do with Kristevan Revolt, so it could be generally addressed to all of you, but the specific perspective comes from Amy's paper, and specifically something that you said, Amy, which is you characterize revolt as a return to the repressed. And you started off by quoting Freud and his example of the knife, and this sort of encounter between the unconscious and the imaginary that must take place for there to be healing. And so, of course, in Freud, especially in Beyond the Pleasure Principle and so forth, the repressed is usually translated as a return of the repressed, in which what is repressed returns sort of in this unforeseen way through dreams or repetitions of certain kinds. And so I'm wondering if you could say more about your usage of the phrase return to the repressed, which implies, if not a willful sort of undergoing of what's repressed or return to it, at least a willing return of some kind that's necessary for healing.
Okay. Yeah, just quickly, I just think that that sort of phrasing was sort of just my general sort of aesthetic reflection of Walker's work. I mean, I really, and in listening to Walker speak, she's very clear that that's what she's doing, that she is doing a willful interrogation, a picking through of our cultural repressed ideas about race and sexuality and desire specifically. I mean, desire is like central in Walker's work, and how desire is both repressed and it also is just like all over the place in her artwork, in her scenes. And so in that way, it's the phrase sort of is just getting to, like you said, a sort of active engagement with the past. Not only an active engagement with the past, but an active engagement with the sort of unconscious ideas about race and gender and sexuality and how they intersect in various ways cross-culturally. And that's what Walker certainly is trying to do with her work, is engaging. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on that. I think you're right to ask that question, like what does it mean for the past to come to us? I think that you're playing with this Freudian notion and you're subverting it, it feels accurate to what Kara Walker is doing. It's not that the past is eating at her. She's eating at the past. She's tormenting the past and making it cause problems for us. So this is how I hear your work. It's beautiful. But you're playing games with Freud's notion of the death drive or repetition compulsion in a way that I think really reflects Kara Walker's work.
Yeah, and she does say somewhere that the silhouette form is meant to be a sort of blank, empty void, a sort of dead void in which it's sort of that happens.
When you were showing me the images, to me, it was very evocative of filled glasses contemporary adaptation of Ambrose Bierce's The Difficulty of Crossing a Field. Especially, and you may not have known that one, but basically it's a plantation owner in the South walks across a field, and there are slaves present, and his brother who is an overseer, and a neighbor and son who owes him money, who is driving by, and he, by all accounts, and this is a historical account, disappeared literally, like he was there and then he was not. And the opera deals with that absence, and it's interesting because there are implications of all people in the society for this disappearance, and what was this disappearance, and what really was it that disappeared. And I think that that's connected to what you're doing, but it's sort of the Carol Walker appears to be representing the traumatized disappearance, and the difficulty of crossing a field seems to connect more to the traumatizer. And I wonder, when we treat trauma this way, do we risk aestheticizing the enactment of trauma? And do we then excuse it? Or how are we working past it? And I think that connects to your paper as well. And I wasn't entirely sure how to resolve it, so I thought I would throw it back to you and see what you thought.
I think in that way, that sort of, and to be very brief, Walker wants that to happen. She wants there to be an ambiguity in her landscape in which you can't always find the oppressor and the oppressed. She's making an ambiguity there, and in some of her other works, you can really see that, and so that's there. And I haven't seen what you were describing, so I've written that down. I'd love to.
It's a beautiful piece. Beautiful. You would love it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
That question was what made me want to write this paper.
Yeah.
This was adapted from a much larger project about folk music, and I don't know if you know the group Anonymous 4, their recovery of old folk music and hymns, right? And I was really very interested in the creation of psychic space, right? The recovery of it. And during a conversation, actually with Sara after a meeting, I said, "You have to hear this beautiful song. I've been obsessed with it." And it was devastating, right, to listen to this song. And we wound up asking ourselves, why? Why do we keep watching this? Why am I so obsessed with this moment of the torturer, right? How does that reestablish psychic space? And I came to the conclusion that John Darnielle's song implicates all of us, right? John Darnielle is, he's American, and he's survived in America through abusing heroin, right? And most of us are wearing clothes that were produced in maquiladoras, and we just don't know, and we don't think about this contradiction, that haunts our lives. We don't think about the trauma that undergirds our society. So I'm not sure that aestheticizing the traumatizer excuses trauma. I think that aestheticizing the traumatizer reveals the devastation that's always been there and has been hidden in the halls of Target. And
May I say a word on this? Because when Bethany first showed me this, I was totally undone by the tracks going around with the camera on the track. And I just said, I see Israel and Palestine. I have the same question for Bethany always about this, and I've been working on torture and trauma, introducing Amery and Bernstein on the problem of the devastation and the breaking of trust in the world. Jean Amery was never going to recover. And even when he saw the execution of one of his torturers, wasn't enough. And it's a question of where the broken morality of history lies. He says it lies in his resentment, his ressentiment. At the same time, I wanted to push in relationship to the work of Kathy Carruth on Witness, because this is Witness. And it strikes me that one has to ask the terribly difficult question of the trauma of the torturer, which is what Danielle raises. And the direction that I find I'm going in is the torturer is the, and it's said many times, but it isn't properly related or articulated enough to the loss of morality, the problem of the collusion between routine and atrocity, is that it is the evacuation of affect. And in that sense, I would really support what Bethany has done today, because it's extremely moving watching Danielle sing. The music is very beautiful, but one never feels relieved.
It's 12:08, and I don't want to take liberties with people's lunch time, so I think we can thank our speakers.